Good evening, my weary friends. Tonight we are going somewhere cold. Not the kind of cold that makes you reach for a cardigan. Not the kind of cold that makes you turn the thermostat up 2 degrees and feel virtuous about it. The kind of cold that has a sound. The kind of cold that has a smell. The kind that settles into the walls of a building and radiates outward and downward and inward all at once. Find in every gap, every crack, every place where a nail meets a board and slips through without invitation. Tonight you're going to the American frontier, to the great plains and the prairies and the mountain valleys in the years between 1840 and 1890, when settlers from the eastern states and from across the Atlantic Ocean were moving into territory that was new to them and ancient to the people already living there, building their homes from whatever the landscape offered, and preparing to face a season that offered no mercy and accepted no excuses. We are going specifically to the winters, and we need to be clear immediately and precisely about what that means. We are talking about the Great Plains states, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Iowa, Minnesota, Wyoming, Colorado. We are talking about the mountain territories of the Rockies. We are talking about the prairies of the Midwest, where the wind comes from the north, with nothing to stop it for 500 miles, and arrives at your door still carrying the full force of everything it has gathered along the way. We are talking about settlers who are largely of European descent, families from Germany, from Scandinavia, from Ireland, from England, from the Eastern American states, who had chosen to make their lives in places that their cultures had not prepared them for, and where the winters were a different category of experience from anything they had previously known. And we're talking about the specific, intimate, daily, hourly challenge of simply surviving the night. Not thriving, not being comfortable, surviving. Waking up in the morning with all the same fingers and toes you went to bed with. Waking up to find the fire had not gone out. Waking up to find the water bucket was not frozen solid. The children's breath had not condensed on the walls into a crust of ice. The baby had made it through another night. This is that story. Your blanket is soft. Your room is warm. Your pillow is exactly right. Theirs was not. Let the story begin. The first night in a new place. Picture yourself standing at the edge of a claim in September of 1872. You are somewhere in the middle of Nebraska on a piece of land that is yours now on paper, that the government has given you in exchange for the promise that you will work it, live on it, improve it. Around you in every direction, as far as you can see in every direction, there is grass. Not the grass of a lawn or a park or a meadow enclosed by trees. Grass to the horizon, grass swaying in the wind that never entirely stops out here. Grass that whispers and hisses and rustles with a sound like distant water. The sky above you is enormous. You have never seen a sky this large before. In the east, where you came from, there were always trees on the horizon. Hills, buildings, something to break the line between earth and air. Out here, there is nothing. The sky simply goes on, and on, and on, until it curves gently and meets the grass. And that is the edge of the visible world. It is beautiful. It is also September. And you have not yet built anything that could be called a house. You have a wagon. You have your family, a wife, 2 children, a baby. You have tools and seeds, and a trunk of clothing and some dried food, and a cow, and a pair of oxen, and a dog named Captain, who has been with you since Missouri, and who is looking at the prairie grass with an expression that suggests he too is recalibrating his expectations. You have perhaps 6 weeks before the first frost, perhaps 8 if the weather is kind, which it will not be, not here, not in Nebraska, in the autumn of a year that the old-timers, if there were old-timers here to ask, would have described as a hard one. 6 weeks to build a shelter that can keep 4 humans and a baby alive through a winter that can drop to 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit and hold there for days. You get to work, building the shelter. What they used and why. Here is the first thing that surprises almost everyone who learns it. On the Great Plains in the 1840s and 1850s and into the decades after, the thing they used to build houses was not wood. It was dirt. Not because they wanted to, not because they had any particular attachment to the idea of living inside a compressed earthen structure, but because on the Great Plains there were no trees. The great forests that covered the eastern states stopped somewhere around the Missouri River, and then there was simply nothing. Not a stand of timber for 30 miles in any direction, not a log to be had, not a plank, not a piece of lumber that did not cost an extraordinary amount of money to haul overland from somewhere that had it. What there was grass, specifically the deep-rooted prairie grass that had been growing in this soil for thousands of years, sending its roots down 3, 4, sometimes 5 feet into the earth, creating a dense, matted, interlocking structure that the settlers came to call sod. When you cut the sod with a special plough, the roots held the cut blocks together like a natural brick. When you stacked the blocks, they held together under their own weight. When you built walls from them, the accumulated earth provided insulation that no log cabin could match. So on the plains, you built a soddy, a sod house. You find the flattest piece of ground you can. You mark out a rectangle, perhaps 12 feet wide and 16 feet long, which sounds generous until you realise that 4 adults and a baby will be living in it for the next 5 months, with no option to step outside except to do chores or visit the outhouse, which is itself a brief, punishing, temperature-related adventure. You cut your sod blocks, each one roughly 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, 4 inches deep, and you stack them grass side down, layer upon layer, staggered like bricks, so the joints do not line up. The walls go up. They are thick, 2 feet thick in most sod houses, sometimes 3. You can run your hand across the interior surface and feel the faint roughness of compressed earth, cool and slightly damp, with occasional threads of roots still visible where they were not cut clean. The smell is specific, deep earth, dried grass, something ancient and mineral. The roof is the problem. Sod walls will stand on their own quite adequately. A sod roof requires support, timber supports, which must be purchased or hauled or bargained for, and which are expensive and heavy and awkward and never quite enough. You lay your timber across the top of the walls, you pile sod over it, you spread grass over the sod, and you have a roof that is reasonably watertight when it is dry, and a spectacular producer of mud insects and falling debris when it is wet. But here is the thing about the sod house that the settlers discovered with genuine surprise: it is warm. Not warm like a heated modern room. Warm relative to the alternative, which is standing in a Nebraska field in February in 30 below weather with nothing between you and the wind. The thick earth walls hold whatever heat is generated inside. They are poor conductors. The cold takes a long time to penetrate them, and the warmth takes a long time to leave them. During the worst nights of the winter, the interior of a properly built sod house could be 20, 30, even 40 degrees warmer than the outside air. Not comfortable, but survivable. Not that any of this is obvious to you in September, standing outside your newly completed soddy and looking at it for the first time. It looks, frankly, like a pile of dirt with a door in it. The dog sniffs it and looks at you with an expression that is very specifically a dog's version of concern. But the wind is picking up from the north, the sky's changing, and you go inside, what the inside feels and sounds and smells like. Step inside. The first thing you notice is the smell. Earth. Deep, pervasive, constant earth. The walls are earth. The floor is earth, packed and beaten flat, but never sealed, never finished, never anything but the ground you're standing on, with the top layer flattened. The smell is not unpleasant exactly. It is the smell of a garden, of turned soil in spring, of the mineral richness of the plains. But it is constant and total and inescapable, and after a week you will carry it in your hair and your clothing wherever you go. The second thing you notice is the darkness. The one window, if you have a window, and many soddies in the early years did not, or had a window covered with oiled paper rather than glass because glass had to be shipped in and cost money, admits a thin, brownish light that does not so much illuminate the room as make the darkness visible. By day it is dim. By night it is absolute. The third thing you notice is the size, 12 by 16 feet. You can walk from one wall to the other in 5 steps. The ceiling is low, 5.5, maybe 6 feet, because the weight of the sod roof requires the timber supports to be placed conservatively, and because you need the walls to hold, which means they cannot be too high. A tall man will duck instinctively for the first week before he learns exactly where the roof beams are. There is a fireplace or a stove, whatever you have managed to bring or acquire. If you're lucky, you have an iron stove, small and efficient, burning wood or coal, or the dried buffalo dung that the settlers quickly discovered worked admirably as fuel, and that they called with the cheerful pragmatism of people who had no choice about their fuel source buffalo chips. If you are less lucky, you have a stone fireplace built into one wall, drawing unpredictably and smoking on windy days because the chimney was built without the benefit of a professional and does its best. On either side of the stove or fireplace, the sleeping arrangements are organised with the economy of people who have very limited space and very clear priorities. The bed, if you have a proper bed frame, is pressed against one wall. If you do not have a bed frame, and many settlers in the early years of a claim did not, you have a tick, which is a fabric sack stuffed with whatever soft material is available. Corn husks, dried grass, straw, wool, if the family had wool. Now it is November. The days have been shortening since September, with a speed that still startles you. The wind has changed. It is coming from the north now, steadily, with the particular quality of northern plains wind in late autumn, not violent but relentless, not a gust but a current, a continuous river of cold air that has travelled 500 miles since it last touched anything warm, and that is in no hurry and has all the time in the world. Tonight it is going to be cold. Not the worst cold of the winter, not yet, but cold enough. You bank the stove. You make sure the water bucket is inside, not out. You pull the quilts from the chest where they have been stored and you spread them on the bed. 1 layer, 2 layers, 3. The children are already inside, already dressed for sleep, which means dressed essentially the same as they are dressed for waking, because nobody is removing wool stockings in November in Nebraska. You pull off your boots, you lie down, and the night begins. The sound of a frontier night. You need to understand the sound. Modern life is never actually silent. Even in the quietest house, in the quietest town, there is a background hum of civilization. Heating systems, refrigerators, the distant sound of traffic, the electromagnetic baseline of a wired world. You have lived inside this hum your whole life without knowing it was there. Out here, in the soddy on the plains in November, there is none of that. What there is wind. The wind in a plains winter is not the wind you know. It does not gust and stop. It does not rise and fall in recognizable patterns. It blows continuously, steadily, with the monotonous persistence of something that is not trying to be threatening, but simply cannot stop. And the sound it makes against the sod walls, and the thin roof, and the edges of the door, is a low, continuous moan that begins before you lie down, and will not have stopped when you wake. On nights when the wind is stronger, and some nights it is much stronger, building into what the settlers called a blue norther, a storm that comes down from Canada with sudden catastrophic force, the sound rises to something that belongs in a different category entirely. It is not a moan, it is a roar that seems to come from every direction simultaneously, that seems to vibrate the walls themselves, that makes the children pull their quilts over their heads and makes you grip the edge of the mattress and listen very hard to make sure the roof is still there. The roof on a bad night makes its own sounds. The sod shifts slightly with temperature changes. The timber supports creak. If there has been snow, and there will be snow soon, and a great deal of it, the accumulated weight presses down on the roof with a silence that is somehow louder than the wind, a presence you can feel rather than hear, a weight that you calculate unconsciously against your assessment of the structural integrity of your roofing timbers. On a quiet night, the plains have their own sounds, the grass always the grass moving in whatever wind is blowing. Somewhere far away, a coyote. Then an answer closer. The dog lifts his head from his place at the foot of the bed. He decides, after a moment of professional assessment, that the coyotes are not his problem tonight. He puts his head back down. The house settles, wood and sod contracting slightly with the drop in temperature. A sound like a quiet knock, then nothing. You listen to your family breathe. There is your wife beside you, warm against your back. There are the children in the trundle, there, breathing the quick, uncomplicated breathing of children who have spent the day doing things children do, and have fallen asleep with the conviction that the night will pass and the morning will come, and there is nothing in particular to worry about. The baby, in her box cradle near the stove, makes the small sounds that babies make. The stove ticks. You banked it carefully. Enough coal to last until 2 or 3 in the morning, when you will have to get up and feed it again, but not so much that the room overheats, which would cause the children to kick off their quilts and expose themselves to the cold that will come when the fire burns lower. The room smells of earth and smoke and bodies and the dried corn husks in the mattress, and the specific smell of wool that has been warmed and is now cooling slightly. These smells become the smell of home. In 30 years, when you're living somewhere else, something warm and earthy and slightly smoky will catch you off guard, and take you back to this room, this night, this specific quality of darkness. You close your eyes, the fire ticks, the wind finds the gap at the top of the door and slides through it with a thin, high whistle. The coyotes stop. The night is very long. The problem of the fire. The fire is everything. This is not a metaphor. The fire in a frontier home in winter is not a comfort or a luxury or a feature. It is the mechanism that keeps you alive. Specifically, it is the mechanism that keeps the interior of your home above the temperature at which human beings can survive overnight, which, if you are elderly or very young or sick, is a narrower margin than you might think. So the fire must be managed, not just lit and left, managed, tended, maintained, thought about. Here is the problem. A fire hot enough to warm a room adequately will consume its fuel in a predictable amount of time. Fuel on the plains is finite, hard to come by, and must be carefully rationed. You cannot simply pile the stove full of coal and go to sleep for 8 hours, because either the stove will consume everything and go cold by 2 in the morning, or it will burn so hot that you have wasted fuel you cannot replace and possibly created a fire hazard in a house made of dried grass and sod. So you learn to bank a fire. Banking is the art of managing a fire so that it sustains itself at a low, slow burn, enough heat to maintain the room temperature through the night without consuming the fuel reserve faster than the hours require. You pack the coals carefully. You adjust the damper on the stove flue. You add a specific amount of fuel calculated by experience. How cold is it tonight? How long is the night? How much is left in the fuel store? How warm do the children need to be? This calculation, which sounds technical when described, becomes, after a few weeks of winter, entirely intuitive. You read the fire the way you read weather, by feel, by colour, by the specific sound the draught makes when it is right. And then you go to bed, and you sleep lightly, with one part of your consciousness still tracking the fire, the way parents sleep with one part of their consciousness still tracking their infant. At some point in the deep of the night, not quite asleep but not quite awake, you will register that the sound of the stove has changed, or that the temperature of the room has shifted, and you will get up. This is what getting up at 2 in the morning in a soddy in Nebraska in December feels like. You push the quilts back. The air above the quilts is a different category of experience from the air under them. Under the quilts, you have been generating warmth for hours. Above the quilts is the room, which is somewhere between 40 and 50 degrees Fahrenheit on a good night, and considerably colder on a bad one. The transition happens in an instant, and your body responds with a full-body shudder that is completely involuntary and does not stop when you want it to. Your feet find the floor. The floor is earth. It is cold in a way that floors in heated modern homes simply are not cold. Not cold like a cold tile floor in a bathroom. Cold like something that has been connected to the frozen ground outside all winter, and is conducting that cold directly into the soles of your feet, which are inside wool stockings, which helps, but not enough. You move to the stove. You feed it. You do this without fully waking up, without lighting a lamp, in the dark, by feel, and by the glow of the coals. The fuel catches. The sound of the stove changes, a deeper, more purposeful note. The temperature of the room will begin to recover in 5 or 10 minutes. You stand there in the dark for a moment, your hands held toward the stove, the heat reaching your palms, watching the coals in the vent glow orange and then brighter. Your feet are still cold, your shoulders are cold, but your hands are warm, and that is enough for right now. You go back to bed. You pull the quilts up. The warmth under them receives you like something living. You are asleep again in 90 seconds. The quilts, more than fabric. The quilts on a frontier bed are not decorative. They are not soft furnishings or aesthetic choices. They are the product of an enormous investment of time and skill and material, and they are understood by everyone who sleeps under them as the primary barrier between the body and the cold. A proper frontier quilt begins with fabric. In the early years of a claim, when money is scarce and the nearest dry goods store may be 40 miles away, fabric comes from whatever the household has. Old shirts, worn dresses, the dress that the youngest child has outgrown, a flour sack that has been washed until it is soft enough to use. Pieces of wool blanket too worn to be useful in their original form, but perfectly serviceable as quilt batting. The top of the quilt is pieced together from these scraps, cut into squares or triangles or the more elaborate patterns that the quilter learns over years of practice, arranged into something that is simultaneously useful and beautiful, that reflects both the maker's skill and the family's material history. One square from a daughter's first dress, one from a husband's work shirt, one from the curtain that hung in the window of the house back east. Run your fingers across the surface of one of these quilts and you're touching years. Years of wearing, years of washing, years of a family's life compressed into the specific texture of aged fabric under your hands. The batting, the middle layer, is whatever insulating material is available. Wool, ideally. Carded cotton, if the family has access to it. Old blankets too deteriorated for independent use, but still functional as filling. The backing is another layer of fabric, heavier, denser. The whole thing is tied or quilted together through all three layers, sometimes in patterns, sometimes in simple straight lines, sometimes at community quilting bees where women gathered and worked together for a day, talking and stitching, and the quilt that emerged at the end of that day carried in its very thread the energy of collective effort. This matters because quilts on the frontier were often the most valuable portable property a family owned. A good feather tick, a mattress stuffed with goose down, could be worth more than the horse. A set of well-made quilts represented months of labour and could make the difference, literally and actually, between a family surviving a bad winter and not. When you pull a frontier quilt over you at night, you pull a weight. 2 quilts, 3, sometimes 4 in the worst months. The combined weight is substantial, pressing you into the mattress, holding you down. In the depths of winter, this weight is not oppressive. It is comfort itself. The physical sensation of being held in place by warm, heavy fabric is one of the deepest comforts available in a body that has spent the day cold and tired. The smell of the quilts is the smell of the family. Wood smoke, absorbed into every fibre over months of living near the fire. The specific smell of the people who sleep under them, warmed by body heat and released slowly through the night. Wool, earth, the faint ghost of whatever soap was last used to wash them. You press your face into the top quilt. You feel the roughness of the fabric. You smell your family and your home, and the cold that is just on the other side of those 3 inches of batting and thread seems for now very far away. The The children sleep differently from the adults. They fall asleep faster. Their bodies generate heat with an efficiency that adults have lost, and they warm their section of the bed quickly, curled into whatever arrangement has become their habit. One child sleeps on her back, with her arms flung wide, monopolizing quilt. One sleeps rolled into a ball so tight that he barely takes up space. They also sleep more deeply. The specific alertness that an adult maintains through the night, the part of the brain that is always tracking the fire and listening to the sound of the roof and calculating whether the baby is breathing steadily. This is not yet present in children. They sleep without reservation, but they also get cold faster. The small body of a child loses heat more quickly than an adult body. The surface area to volume ratio works against them. A child whose quilts have slipped in the night can be in genuine danger before they wake up, because the cooling happens slowly, insidiously, without the dramatic signals that would wake an adult. So the parents sleep with one ear specifically tuned to the children, not consciously, not as a deliberate act of vigilance, but as the automatic, unconscious monitoring that parenthood installs in a person and never entirely removes. If a child's breathing changes, if the rhythm shifts, if a cough develops, if the sounds of movement stop altogether, a parent in the next bed will surface from sleep with a speed that seems impossible given how recently they were completely unconscious. The baby is the most constant concern. The baby sleeps in the wooden box cradle near the stove, near enough to benefit from the warmth, far enough that the risk of sparks or falling embers is reduced. The cradle is lined with whatever soft material is available. The baby is wrapped, swaddled, tucked, and still the mother wakes periodically through the night to check, to touch the baby's cheek with the back of her hand, to confirm the warmth, the breathing, the continued presence of life in that small wrapped form. In the morning sometimes there is ice on the inside of the window, a thin crust of it tracing the outline of the oiled paper or glass, crystallized from the moisture in the family's breath meeting the cold of the exterior wall. The children discover this and scrape patterns in it with their fingernails, giggling, the game made sweeter by the fact that the ice is evidence of cold held at bay. This morning everyone is inside and warm and alive, and the ice is just a game. But the parents look at it and make their calculations. The plains winter versus the mountain winter. The frontier winter was not one thing. It was several things depending on where you were. On the Great Plains, Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, the winter was defined by two enemies operating in combination: cold and wind. The temperature alone was survivable. 30 below 0 Fahrenheit is extreme cold by any measure, but in still air a properly insulated body can manage it. What the plains added to this was the wind that never stopped, the wind that drove the cold into every crack, every gap, every insufficiently chinked joint in a sod wall, with the focused intention of something that has a purpose. The plains wind in winter is a physical experience that is difficult to convey to someone who has not stood in it. It is not blowing against you from one direction. It seems to come from everywhere at once, finding you regardless of which way you turn, pressing against your face and your chest and the backs of your knees simultaneously, stealing the warmth from exposed skin with a speed that is alarming the first time and merely unpleasant the 100th. The blizzard is the worst expression of this combination. When a blizzard came to the plains, and they came some years with terrifying frequency, it came without the long warning that modern weather forecasting provides. You might walk out of your soddy on a cold but clear morning to find the sky to the northwest a peculiar greenish grey, and within an hour the world had vanished, not metaphorically, literally. The snow in a plains blizzard is driven horizontally by wind of such force that the air itself becomes white, and visibility drops to nothing, to less than nothing, to a white blindness in which you cannot see your hand in front of your face. In this whiteness, a man could become lost between his soddy and his barn. Not because the barn was far, it might be 20 feet away, but because in white blindness all directions are equal, and 20 feet is enough to get turned around and walk in the wrong direction and keep walking. People died this way. Not old people or sick people, healthy adults who knew their land, who had walked between their house and their barn 10,000 times, who stepped outside for what should have been a 5-minute task and were found, sometimes days later, when the storm cleared, 100 yards from their own door. The settlers developed a solution that was simple and practical and slightly heartbreaking in its implications. They tied a rope from the house to the barn before winter began, a thick rope fixed to the door frame and to the barn wall, so that in a blizzard you could step outside and hold the rope and follow it, hand over hand, from building to building, without needing to see anything at all. The rope hung there all winter, slack in fair weather, vital in the worst. The children learned never to step outside in uncertain weather without knowing where the rope was. In the mountains, Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, the ranges of the Rockies, the winter was a different category of experience. The cold could be just as severe, and sometimes more so, particularly at elevation. But the enemy was less wind than snow. Mountain snow in a bad winter was measured not in inches, but in feet, accumulating on roofs until structures groaned under the weight, blocking doors and windows until the family inside was sealed from the outside world as completely as if they had been buried. A mountain cabin in January could be buried to its eaves. The door, when you finally managed to push it open against the drift that had formed against it overnight, opened into a wall of white. You tunnelled out. You created a path to the outhouse, to the barn, to the wood pile. 3 destinations that represented the 3 non-negotiable requirements of continued existence in a mountain winter. The outhouse because the human body has needs that cannot be indefinitely deferred. The barn because the animals would die without daily feeding and watering. The woodpile because without it the fire would go out. These 3 paths were maintained regardless of conditions. In a blizzard, in a whiteout, at 30 below zero, the path to the woodpile was maintained. Because the alternative was not maintaining the path to the woodpile, which led very quickly to the fire going out, which led very quickly to conditions inside the cabin becoming indistinguishable from conditions outside it. The clothing, wool, and layer and wool again. What do you actually wear? You wear wool. Primarily, persistently, in multiple layers, you wear wool. The innermost layer is a long woolen undershirt and long woolen underdrawers, pulled on in the morning and not removed again until laundry day, which in the depths of winter may be a theoretical rather than a practical concept. Over these go the day's outer garments, shirt, trousers, or dress, whichever the custom and the person require, also wool, or as much wool, as the family's resources provide. Some outer garments are cotton or linen, which are functional in other seasons, but which a winter wind treats with complete indifference. The wool holds warmth in a way that other natural fibres do not. It traps air between its fibres. It retains a significant amount of its insulating capacity, even when damp, which matters enormously on the plains and in the mountains, where the difference between a wet outer garment and a dry one can be the difference between manageable cold and dangerous cold. Wool that has gotten wet and then dried smells like something specific, something that is simultaneously unpleasant and reassuring, because it means the wool has done its job. On your head you wear a wool cap that covers your ears. This is not negotiable. The human head loses a disproportionate amount of body heat, and in genuine cold, the ears are the first things to suffer. Frostbite starts at the extremities, ears, nose, fingers, toes, working inward with a patience that is not hurried because the cold has all the time it needs. On your hands in genuine cold, you wear mittens rather than gloves. The distinction is important. Mittens keep all four fingers together in a single warm pocket, sharing their heat, while gloves separate them and expose more surface area. In the worst cold, the difference between mittened and gloved hands is significant enough that people choose the mitten's loss of dexterity willingly, because dexterity is only useful if your fingers still work, and fingers that have been too cold for too long stop working. On your feet are wool stockings inside leather boots. The boots, ideally, have been greased with tallow or lard to maintain some degree of water resistance, because a boot that lets moisture in is an instrument of frostbite rather than protection against it. The wool stockings inside the boots trap air and hold warmth even when damp. At night, you remove the boots. You do not remove the stockings. You do not remove the undershirt or the underdrawers. You add possibly an additional wool garment if the night promises to be particularly cold. You may add the wool cap to the nighttime ensemble, because the head that is not covered loses heat all night the cold air above the quilts, and the body that is losing heat from the head is working harder than necessary to maintain its core temperature. The children wear the children's version of all of this, assembled from the same limited materials and repaired endlessly as they grow, because in a frontier family nothing is discarded that can still serve a function, and a wool stocking with a hole in the toe that has been darned 3 times is still a wool stocking. You go to bed dressed for winter, because winter is where you're sleeping. The Sod House. Versus The Log Cabin, a tale of 2 shelters. Not everyone on the frontier built the same shelter. The geography determined the building material, and the building material determined the experience of winter in ways that settlers discovered through their own cold and uncomfortable field research. In the forested regions, the upper Midwest, the Ozarks, the mountain territories where timber was available, the log cabin was the default structure. You felled trees, you trimmed them, you stacked them in the specific interlocking pattern that cabin builders had been using for generations. The gaps between the logs, and there were always gaps because logs are round and do not fit together without spaces between them, were filled or chinked with whatever material was available. Moss clay, mud mixed with hair, rags soaked in lard pressed into the crevices and left to harden, wet newspaper applied like plaster and allowed to freeze solid, which worked better than it sounds as a temporary solution and was replaced with something more permanent when circumstances allowed. Run your hand along the inside wall of a log cabin in January and you feel what the settlers felt. The bark, rough and dry, and then, at the joints between logs, the specific texture of whatever had been packed into that gap. Sometimes firm and solid, sometimes crumbling, worked loose by the freeze-thaw cycle, or simply deteriorated from the months of use. And through the crumbling spots, a thin cold thread of air, finding its way in with the patience of something that has all winter. The log cabin was warmer than nothing. It was often not as warm as it needed to be. The sod house, counterintuitively, was better in the extreme cold of the open plains. The 2-foot thick earth walls conducted cold slowly, much more slowly than the thin walls of a hastily constructed log cabin. The air inside a well-built soddy stayed warmer longer and recovered its warmth faster when the fire was fed. The settlers who moved from log cabins to sod houses, or who came from regions where log cabins were the standard and arrived on the treeless plains to discover sod was the only option, were often surprised. They had expected to feel sorry for themselves. Instead they were warmer. The compensating disadvantage of the sod house was the ceiling. A sod roof was a living thing. In dry weather it was stable. In the thaw-freeze cycles of early spring it dripped constantly. Settlers described waking to find a thin crust of ice on their bedding where the overnight drip had frozen before morning, and then waking again on warmer days to find everything damp from the melt. Cookware was positioned under the persistent drips. Beds were moved away from the worst spots, then moved again when new spots developed, and the creatures. A sod roof was essentially a horizontal piece of prairie, compressed and inverted, and it contained whatever the prairie contained. Roots, insects, and occasionally the tunnelling creatures who did not immediately understand that a ceiling was not supposed to be traversable from above. Mice were the most common. A mouse dropping through the roof onto the face of a sleeping child was a documented and not uncommon event, and the family cat, if the family had one, and most did, earned its keep with a thoroughness that no pet cat in a modern apartment building has ever been asked to match. The smell of a soddy after rain was different from the smell of a soddy in dry weather. The dry earth smell, mineral and constant, gave way after rain to something richer, more complicated. The smell of wet earth and wet roots and the specific wet wool quality of a room that has absorbed moisture from above and is slowly releasing it into the air. It was not a bad smell. It was a deeply specific smell, the smell of a home that was made of the same material as its surrounding landscape, that breathed with the weather rather than against it. You lay in your bed in a soddy on a January night, and you were surrounded by earth. The floor was earth. The walls were earth. Above you, 8 inches of compressed sod and grass. You were, in the most literal sense, inside the ground. This could have been claustrophobic. Many settlers found that instead it was grounding in both senses, a physical connection to the land they were building their lives on, a sense of being held rather than exposed. The wind was outside, the earth was around you, the fire was in the stove. You pulled the quilt up and felt the specific weight of 3 layers of patchwork, and thought for a moment, about the woman who had stitched these together in the evenings by the light of a tallow lamp on the other side of the Missouri River. Before all this, you stopped thinking and slept. The specific sound of each type of cold has different sounds depending on its character. This is something the settlers learned over their first winter, and that became, by the second and third winter, simply part of how they understood the season. A still cold with no wind has almost no sound at all. The snow muffles everything. Sound that would travel a mile in summer does not carry the same distance in still cold winter air, or rather it carries differently, arriving at unexpected intervals and from unexpected directions, distorted by the specific acoustics of a landscape covered in several feet of sound-absorbing white. A still cold night is the quietest thing most people ever experience, and it has its own particular quality of quiet, not the quiet of an interior room with the door closed, but the quiet of a vast outdoor space that has simply decided to stop making noise. In that stillness, inside the soddy, you hear things you would not otherwise hear. The settling of the structure itself, the tiny infrequent sounds of sod and timber adjusting to temperature, the sound of the fire which has its own vocabulary, the tick of a hot stove at its working temperature, the lower mutter of a banking fire, the sudden sharp reports of a resin pocket in a log making itself known, the breathing of everyone in the room, which in a still night you can hear, with a clarity that is both reassuring and slightly unsettling, because you are aware of the breathing in a way that ordinary background noise would mask. A windy cold is a different experience entirely. The wind on the plains does not make one sound. It makes dozens of sounds simultaneously, layered and shifting. The low continuous moan against the walls, the higher whistle at the gap under the door, the specific sound of a shutter that has worked loose and is beginning incrementally to rattle. Not loudly, not dramatically, just with the patient insistence of something that will become a problem if not addressed. The creak of the roof structure under load. In a blizzard, the wind makes a sound that settlers compared to nothing so much as a freight train, though in 1872 not everyone had heard a freight train, and so descriptions in diaries reached for other comparisons, like the sea in a storm, like something alive and angry, like the prairie itself had decided to move. The sound of a blizzard against a sod house was different from the sound of a blizzard against a log cabin. The thick earth walls absorbed some of the impact, muffled some of the roar. A person inside a soddy during a bad blizzard heard the storm more distantly than a person inside a log cabin whose thin walls transmitted every gust directly into the room. This was another advantage, quieter than the thermal one, but real. The sod house did not feel like it was being attacked. It felt like it was being held. And then there was the specific sound of frost, the crack of a tree or a post contracting in severe cold, a sound sharp and sudden as a rifle shot that woke you instantly and completely from sleep before your conscious mind had time to identify what it was. Your heart in your throat for 3 full seconds before reason reasserted itself. Frost crack, just frost crack. The world contracting around the cold. You lay still, listening. Nothing followed. The wind continued its patient moan. The fire ticked. You slept again. The children's world. Inside the winter. For the children, the frontier winter had a texture that was entirely different from the adult's experience of the same season. The adults managed the fire and rationed the food and calculated the fuel supply and lay awake in the night counting risks. The children were inside a long indoor adventure that had its inconveniences but also its considerable pleasures. The confines of the soddy, which the adults experienced as constraining, the children experienced as intimate. The small space was their entire world for the duration of the worst weather, and they filled it with the activity that children have always brought to confined spaces: noise, invention, argument, reconciliation, and the specific creative energy of minds that have not yet learned to be bored by the given world. Games were created from whatever was available. A set of smooth stones picked up in autumn, before the ground froze and kept in a cloth bag through the winter, became multiple different games, depending on the day and the inclination. Checkers drawn in charcoal on a flat board. Cat's cradle with a length of cord that has been repurposed from something else, and would be repurposed again when the game was finished. Riddles repeated until every answer was known, and then told again, because the telling was the point rather than the mystery. The younger children had their specific pleasures, the breath clouds that appeared when you breathed into the cold air above the quilts, exhaled deliberately to make the cloud as large as possible, watching it rise and dissipate. The frost patterns on the window, the specific crystalline geometry of ice forming on glass or oiled paper, different every morning, always geometric, always intricate, tracing the specific humidity and temperature of the night in a pattern that would never exist again in quite that form. A child's finger tracing a frost pattern, the finger warming the glass, the frost retreating from the touch. This was 10 minutes of entertainment that cost nothing and left no mess and required no materials except a cold window and a curious child. The older children had different pleasures and different responsibilities. A girl of 12 on the frontier in 1875 was not a child in the way that a 12-year-old in a modern context understands the category. She was a working member of the household, contributing genuinely necessary labour. She cooked when her mother needed rest. She managed the younger children when they needed managing. She sewed and mended with skill, because the frontier did not maintain a distinction between adult competence and child incompetence in matters where the household needed everyone functional. And she also, in the evenings, when the work was done, and the fire was going and the small oil lamp was lit, read. All was read too, the specific pleasure of a story in a winter evening, in a small warm room with the dark outside and the wind doing its thing, is a pleasure that has not changed significantly between 1875 and the present moment, because it is rooted in something fundamental about the human relationship to narrative and warmth and darkness, and the desire to be somewhere else for a little while. The youngest children went to sleep first. They were tucked in, specifically, carefully tucked, the quilts pressed down around the edges of the small body to minimise the cold air that could find its way under, and then lay in the specific alert stillness of children who are supposed to be asleep, but are in fact listening to everything. The story their father was reading, the song their mother was humming, the conversation in voices too low to make out the words, but with a tone that told them everything was all right. They slept. The adults sat by the fire for another hour, doing the work that the evenings required, and the room held its warmth, and the wind did what the wind did, and the night passed. The midwinter feast, February's one good evening. It happened differently in different families, but it happened, in some form, in almost all of them. The deliberate decision to eat well on one particular night in the deep of winter, regardless of what it cost the supply. February was the hard month. November still had the freshness of a new experience. December had the anchor of whatever holiday traditions the family observed. January was grim but early. February was when the fuel store was visibly lower than it should be, and the bean barrel was reliably more prominent in the diet than anyone had hoped. And the children had been inside for 3 months, and the adults had been inside for 3 months, and spring was still at least 6 weeks away on a good year and longer on a bad one. On one particular evening in February, by common consent or by the decision of whoever made these decisions in the household, the family ate something that was not beans, perhaps the last ham that had been saved specifically for this occasion, smoked and hung in the soddy's coolest corner since November, unwrapped now with the specific ceremony that preserved things are unwrapped with. Perhaps a dried apple pie, made from the apples that had been set aside in September and kept carefully through the months. The dried slices soaked overnight and cooked slowly with the last of the cinnamon and whatever sugar remained. Perhaps simply a cornbread made sweeter than usual, with a small measure of sorghum that had been rationed carefully to this night. Whatever it was better than what they had been eating, and the difference was enormous in its effect on the quality of the evening. The children felt it. The atmosphere of the room changed with the smell of something richer than beans cooking on the stove. The adults felt it. The specific compression of midwinter endurance loosened slightly, and what replaced it was not happiness exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition that they were still a family, still capable of pleasure, still on the right side of the winter, still here. The meal was eaten slowly. Nobody rushed it. The conversation was easier than it had been for weeks. The children were allowed to stay up later than usual because what was the point of the extra warmth and the special food if you went to bed at the regular time? Stories were told. The specific stories of good times. The summer just past, the autumn harvest, however it had been. The places left behind before the move west. Outside the wind continued. The stove consumed fuel at its measured rate. The night was no warmer than any other February night. But inside the soddy, on this one specific evening, winter was not winning. The family went to sleep that night well fed and slightly warmer in the spirit than they had been in weeks. The quilts received them. The fire held. In the morning it was still February, but it was the February that came after the feast, and that was different. Preparing for the next night, the eternal routine. Every evening before sleep, the same things. The fire was checked, adjusted, banked to its overnight configuration. This required no thought by February of the first winter. It had become as automatic as breathing. The specific muscle memory of a particular turn of the damper, and a particular arrangement of the fuel, and a particular assessment of how cold the night was going to be, based on whatever evidence was available. The water bucket was positioned inside, where it would not freeze. This seems like a simple thing. It was a simple thing, but it was a thing that had to happen every evening, regardless of how tired you were, because forgetting it meant waking to ice in the morning and starting the day's cooking without water, which meant melting snow, which meant waiting for the snow to melt on the stove, which cascaded into a dozen small inconveniences that a frontier morning simply could not absorb. The boots were positioned near, but not too near the stove, near enough to be warm when you pulled them on in the morning, not so near that the leather dried out and cracked. The extra quilts were brought in from the chest if the night promised to be particularly cold. How did you know if the night was going to be particularly cold? By the sky, by the wind, by the temperature at sundown, by the specific quality of the cold air that came in when you opened the door to bank the snow against the walls, by experience, by the specific knowledge that comes from spending a winter in a place and learning its particular signs. The rope to the barn was checked, not every evening, not when the weather was settled and calm, but in the seasons of uncertainty the rope was pulled, tested, confirmed to be still in place, still fastened at both ends, still the reliable thread that connected the two most important structures on the claim. The animals were tended, the cow fed, the water checked, the chickens secured in their coop, the dog brought in and positioned at his spot at the foot of the bed, where he accepted the arrangement with the contentment of a creature who had made a very good decision by choosing this particular family. And then you stopped. You sat for a moment in whatever light remained, the lamp if there was oil, the firelight if not, and you took stock of the day, what had been accomplished, what remained, what tomorrow required. Then the lamp went out, or you simply turned away from the fire, and you lay down under the quilts and felt their weight settle around you, and heard the wind start its night-long conversation with the walls, and listened to your family breathe. Tomorrow the same things would need to happen, and the day after that, and the day after that, until spring, which was coming. It was always coming. You had simply to get through tonight first. Tonight was something you could manage. Tonight you had the fire and the quilts and the dog and the banked snow and the quilts and the stove and the warm stone at your feet and the breathing of your family around you. Tonight was going to be fine. You closed your eyes. The fire ticked. The wind sang at the door. The night began. The food, what sustained them, what you eat through a frontier winter, is a question of what you had the wisdom and the time and the resources to put by in the autumn, and what the land and the weather have left you by the time February arrives. The ideal winter store, assembled by a well-prepared family in a good year, might include barrels of salted pork, kegs of cornmeal, dried beans, navy beans, pinto beans, the specific weight and rattle of dried beans in a tin container being one of the comfort sounds of a well-stocked frontier autumn, dried apples twisted and chewy that reconstitute slowly in water into something approximating their original sweetness, potatoes stored in the coolest section of the soddy where they'll not freeze, winter squash, onions, possibly some preserved tomatoes if the garden had been good and the family had the time, and the jars. This is the ideal. The reality, by February, is that the ideal has been eroded by 4 months of eating. By February, the salted pork barrel is getting low. The cornmeal is being measured with care. The dried apples are gone. What remains is beans. Beans cooked in water over the stove, seasoned with salt, and whatever can be added to make them interesting. Beans for breakfast, beans for dinner, beans for supper. Beans that have been cooking since this morning, because when you're rationing fuel, You leave things on the stove rather than lighting the fire again. The smell of a frontier soddy in February is the smell of beans and wood smoke and unwashed wool and earth. You will not notice it yourself after the first week. Visitors from outside will notice it, the corn cake baked on the iron griddle over the stove. The specific texture of hasty pudding, cornmeal boiled in water until thick, eaten hot with a scrape of whatever fat is available. The taste of water that has been stored in a barrel inside the soddy and has acquired over the months the specific flavour of its container and the ambient smells of the room. There is the afternoon when the flour runs out. This is an event, not a disaster, at least not immediately. But it is the day when the nature of the winter changes slightly. Bread has been part of every meal, baked in the Dutch oven on the stove, or in the small oven of the cast iron range, if you're lucky enough to have a range. The specific smell of bread baking in a cold room, the warmth that the baking itself adds to the air, the dense, slightly sour loaf that comes out of the oven. These are not luxuries in a frontier winter. They are the warm centre of a cold day. When the flour is gone, you make do with what remains. You find things in the barrel or the tin or the corner of the root cellar that you had not been accounting on. You are creative, because the alternative to creativity in February on the Great Plains is considerably less pleasant. The children do not understand entirely that this is difficult. They know that some days there is more to eat than others. They know that February is different from December. But they do not know the specific arithmetic of the flour barrel or the salt pork keg, and they do not know the particular expression on their mother's face when she opens the barrel and makes her calculation and closes it again without speaking. You wake in the night sometimes, and your stomach is not full. This is the specific animal discomfort of being slightly hungry in the cold. Not starvation, not even close, but the insistent reminder that the body needs fuel and the fuel is being rationed. You pull the quilt tighter. You breathe the warm air under the covers. You listen to the wind. You go back to sleep. Morning will come and there will be cornmeal. There is always cornmeal. The immigrant winters, what they brought with them. They came from everywhere. From Germany in the largest numbers, families who had farmed in Bavaria or Saxony and knew cold winters, but not this cold, not this flat, not this wind. They brought their language and their recipes and their specific way of building and their theology and their particular relationship with the dark months of the year, which in the German tradition carried its own cultural weight, the Advent waiting, the Christmas celebration, the long evenings of the Stube where the family gathered close. In Nebraska and Kansas and the Dakotas, the German families built their soddies with a specific Germanic precision and organised their winter stores with a Germanic thoroughness that their neighbours sometimes admired and sometimes gently mocked. The root cellar was dug before the house was finished. The provisions were catalogued. The fuel was stacked in precise cords, measured and accounted. On Christmas Eve, in a soddy on the Great Plains, a German family sang, not softly, the songs they had known since childhood, learned in churches where the acoustics carried the sound up to stone vaults that a Nebraska sod ceiling could not approximate, but sung with the same conviction regardless. O Tannenbaum, stille Nacht, the words in German, in a room that smelled of earth and coal smoke, and the specific smell of the small amount of ginger that had been saved for the season's baking. The children received small gifts, a carved wooden figure, a piece of hard candy that had survived the journey west in the bottom of a trunk. They did not expect more. They were children of a time and place that understood scarcity without resentment, who measured abundance in different units than the children of later decades would be taught to use. From Scandinavia, they came in numbers that surprised the eastern states, but made perfect demographic sense. Norway and Sweden were countries of agricultural poverty in the mid-19th century, countries where the land was already claimed, and the future was already spoken for, and where the offer of free or cheap land in America was not an abstraction, but a specific and urgent possibility. They arrived in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, in the Dakotas, and found winters that were, in their intensity, approximately familiar. Not the same, not the specific quality of a Norwegian coastal winter, but cold and dark in ways they had been cold and dark before. What the Scandinavian settlers brought was specific technical knowledge about winter that the American frontier had not seen before. They knew how to pack snow for insulation with a confidence that came from cultures that had been doing it for centuries. They knew the properties of different types of cold, that the damp cold of a maritime winter and the dry cold of a continental one required different strategies, and they adjusted accordingly. They knew lullabies in Norwegian that their children would sing to their grandchildren in English, the melody unchanged across the translation. In the evenings, in the long winter weeks, they told stories. Not the stories of the frontier. Those were still being made, still happening around them, still too immediate to have become stories rather than events. They told the stories of Norway, of Sweden, of the specific landscape they had left behind. The fjords, the northern lights which they saw here too, over the Dakota plains, identical in physics, but somehow different in feeling when viewed from this flat, treeless place that was not home and was slowly becoming home. The Irish families who came, driven west by a famine that had shaped a generation, brought a different relationship to scarcity. They had starved, or their parents had starved, in a way that created a specific knowledge of what deprivation felt like at its most extreme. On the frontier in the worst February, when the bean barrel was low and the children were quiet in the way that hungry children become quiet, the Irish mothers and fathers knew precisely that this was not that. This was hard. This was not what they had escaped. They fed the children first and ate last, and felt, in the doing of it, something that was not quite the old country grief, but carried the shape of it. They sang too in the evenings, the specific songs of a culture that uses music for everything, for grief and celebration, and the ordinary passing of time, and the long work of surviving a winter that was less than what had been, but more than enough. The smell of the season, every month different, a frontier winter, did not smell the same in November as it did in February. The smell changed as the season progressed, charting the specific passage of time in the confined space of the soddy with a fidelity that no calendar could match. November smelled like the beginning of something, the fresh straw in the mattress, replaced just before the cold came, giving off the clean, dry smell of new-cut grass, the newly sealed gaps in the walls, the clay and mud still not quite cured, releasing a mineral earthiness that was distinct from the older earth smell of the walls themselves. The first fires of the season in the stove, burning with the slightly smoky quality of a heating system being asked to operate after months of rest, the metal expanding, the flue adjusting. Underneath all of this, the outside smell, the cold, clean smell of the first snow, the specific mineral sharpness of frozen air when you open the door. Cold air does not smell the same as warm air. It smells cleaner, emptier, less organic, as though the cold has stripped away everything that the warmer air carried and left only the fundamental thing. December smelled like the middle of something. The stove was at its steady operational temperature now, and the smell of the fuel, coal or wood or buffalo chips, depending on what was available and what had been laid in, was as constant as the air itself. The specific smell of whatever was cooking, which in December was still varied enough that the evening meal carried its own particular note: cornbread, dried apple, the specific smell of salt pork rendering in a cast iron pan, fat becoming transparent, the smell rich and specific, and to people who were cooking with limited fat, immensely satisfying. January smelled like endurance. The straw in the mattress had been compressed and warmed and breathed over for 2 months, and smelled less like fresh grass and more like the people who slept on it. Not unpleasant, simply changed, humanized. The walls of the soddy had absorbed 2 months of cooking smoke and body warmth and the specific combined smell of a family living in close quarters. The fuel burned with the slightly different character of winter fuel that has been stored and has lost some of its freshness. The cold outside had a different quality, drier, harder, less willing to carry any organic note at all. February smelled like the bottom. The mattress was what it was going to be until spring. The walls were saturated with the winter, carrying every smell the season had produced. The bean barrel contributed its own note, dried legumes, soaking, cooking, the honest smell of sustenance that is not exciting but is real, the specific smell of wool that has been worn and slept in and warmed and cooled for 4 months, and underneath all of it, still the earth that is the house. That was the floor, that was the ceiling, that was the landscape in every direction as far as you could go. The smell of the Great Plains in winter, held inside a house that was made of the Great Plains, breathing it in and breathing it out. The smell of where you were, of what you had chosen, of the particular piece of the world you had decided to call home. By late February, when the temperature began some days to hesitantly suggest the direction of spring without quite committing to it, the smell of the outside air changed slightly, barely, almost imperceptibly, something slightly less mineral, slightly less empty. The faint, distant ghost of something organic returning to air that had been stripped bare for months. You noticed it one morning when you opened the door to start the day's chores. You stopped. You stood in the doorway for a moment with the cold coming in around you, and you breathed, not spring, not yet, not close, but the direction of spring, the faintest inclination that way. You closed the door. You started the day, but you had felt it, and that was something. What the night sky showed them. On clear nights, and there were clear nights, even in the worst winters, the plains sky clearing between storms, with an abruptness that matched the speed with which the storms arrived. The sky above the frontier was unlike anything most of the settlers had seen before, in the towns and cities they had come from, In the villages of Germany and Norway and Ireland, the sky at night was visible, but bounded by buildings, by hills, by the ambient light of other people nearby. Out here, there was nothing between your eyes and the full extent of the dark universe above. The horizon was flat in every direction. The sky was the whole sky. The Milky Way was a physical presence, not a faint smear at the edge of vision, but a structure, a thing with depth and texture, pouring from one horizon to the other with a brightness that made the shadows visible below it. You could read by the Milky Way on a clear winter night, if the text was large enough. Not easily, not comfortably, but you could. The stars were so numerous that constellations were harder to find than in a light-polluted sky, because picking out a pattern of 7 stars becomes difficult when those 7 stars are surrounded by 300 others of comparable brightness. You had to know the patterns, had to have been taught them, had to have practiced finding them in skies that already offered fewer distractions. The northern lights appeared, some winters, over the Dakota Prairie. Not as dramatic as over northern Norway or Alaska, not the full curtains of dancing green and red that the far northern latitudes produces, but real, visible, undeniable. A pale shimmer at the northern horizon that, on the best nights, resolved into something that moved, that breathed, that had colour and motion and the specific quality of a thing that should not be there, and is. The Scandinavian settlers called it by the names they had used at home. Others made their own names for it, or simply stood outside in the cold and watched, their breath making small clouds in the still night air, until the cold drove them back inside. You lay on your back in the soddy, and the wind was outside and the fire was ticking, and the family was breathing, and above the sod ceiling, invisible and immense, the winter sky was doing what it had been doing for millions of years without any need for an audience, and without any particular interest in whether you survived your winter or not. This could have felt indifferent, could have felt cold in the emotional sense, not just the physical, but most settlers, when they wrote about the plains sky, wrote about it differently. They wrote about being small in a way that was not diminishing. They wrote about a sky that made the soddy and the cold and the beans and the fuel rationing all seem the right size, manageable, specific, human scale, against the background of something that had no scale at all. The night sky in winter over the Great Plains was one of the things that nobody had told them about before they came, and one of the things that most of them, in the letters they wrote to people back east, found hardest to describe. You just had to see it, they wrote. You had to be there on a clear February night, outside in the cold for exactly as long as the cold would allow, looking up, and then you went back inside, and the fire was going, and the quilts were waiting, and you lay down and closed your eyes, and the cold settled around the house, and you slept, and the sky did what it always did, above you, unconcerned. What they wrote home. About the letters they wrote back east were specific documents of a specific experience, and reading them more than a century later is an unsettling kind of intimacy. The private thoughts of people who did not know they would be read are addressed to specific people who are long dead, about winters that seem impossible from the vantage point of central heating and grocery stores. The letters describe things with a precision that suggests the writers understood they were reporting on a reality their readers could not entirely imagine. They gave temperatures. They described wind in specific terms. Not just windy, but the specific behaviour of the wind, the direction it came from, how long it had been blowing, what it did to the snow. They described the state of the fuel supply with the careful accounting of people who were tracking something important. Some letters were matter-of-fact to the point of seeming cold. We are well. The weather has been severe. The children are healthy. We are managing. This was not lack of feeling. This was the specific emotional register of people who were managing, who were proud of managing, who wanted the people they had left behind to know that they were managing. The pride in endurance was real, and it shaped the way the endurance was described. Other letters were different. Letters written late at night after the children were asleep, by lamplight that was running low, in handwriting that shows the cold in the way the pen was held, tighter than usual, the letters more cramped. These letters said things like, "Some days I wonder if we made the right decision. Some days the wind does not stop. Some days I miss you very much. Some days the children look at me, and I am glad they cannot see what I'm thinking." And then, in the same letter, a paragraph later, "But the land is good, and the summer was better than we expected, and I believe that this winter, like the last, will end. Spring is a fact, even when it does not feel like one." The letters were sent when the weather permitted travel to the nearest post office, which in the worst of winter might be infrequent. They arrived weeks later. The replies took weeks more. A question asked in October arrived in answer form in January, by which time the situation had changed entirely, and the answer was to a winter that had already passed into memory. They wrote anyway, because the writing mattered, not just the communication, because putting the experience into words was a way of making it legible, of finding in the specific details of a difficult winter the shape of something that could be shared with people who were not there, and in the sharing made more bearable, because if you could describe it, you were above it slightly. You were the person telling the story, not just the person living it, and the person telling the story was going to survive to tell it. They were right. Most of them did. The Snowers Alley here is something that surprised almost every settler on the Great Plains, and that many of them came to rely on: snow, the very substance that represented winter's assault, could be used as winter's defence. You bank the snow against the walls of the soddy in the first heavy storm, not by accident, deliberately. You take a shovel, or your hands if necessary, and you pile the snow against the outer walls, building it up until it reaches the level of the window, sometimes higher. You pack it firm. You create around the base of your house a thick insulating layer of compressed snow that the wind cannot penetrate, and that holds the warmth inside with surprising effectiveness. The principle is the same one that makes an igloo possible. Snow is not cold in itself, or rather, it is cold, but it is also an excellent insulator, trapping air in its crystalline structure and preventing the rapid heat exchange that cold wind accelerates. The temperature inside a snow cave or an igloo can be 30 or 40 degrees warmer than the outside air, held there entirely by the insulating property of the snow itself. Against a sod wall that is already thick and well insulating, a bank of snow adds another layer. The draft that was finding the gap between the bottom of the wall and the ground is stopped. The cold that was conducting upward through the foundation is slowed. The warmth that was seeping out through the lower portion of the wall is kept inside. The children discover the snowbank and immediately begin to tunnel into it. You stop them for the obvious structural reasons. They look at you with the specific expression of children who understand perfectly well why something is prohibited and intend to wait until you're not looking, inside the soddy on a day when the snowbank is well established and the fire is burning at its careful, measured rate. You can feel the difference in the air. It is still cold. It will always be cold. But the specific cutting quality of the cold, the sense that the air is moving, that it is finding its way in and replacing the warmth with the relentless efficiency of wind through gaps, is diminished. The room feels, if not comfortable, at least contained. The animals. You have a cow. You have probably some chickens. You have the dog, Captain. Captain sleeps inside. This is not a sentimental decision. Captain is a large dog, and a large dog generates a meaningful amount of heat. And in a frontier winter, meaningful amounts of heat from any source are welcomed without prejudice. Captain has a place at the foot of the bed, and he occupies it with the commitment of someone who understands exactly how cold the floor is and exactly how warm the quilts make things by proximity, and he has drawn the obvious conclusion. In the mornings when it is very cold, you can feel the warmth from Captain's body through the quilts at your feet. It is not dramatic warmth, but it is real warmth, and in the specific arithmetic of frontier winter heating, real warmth from any source is never trivial. The cow is in the barn. The barn is separate from the soddy, not for any reason of preference, but because a cow in a sod house, while considerably warmer for everyone involved, presents practical challenges that outweigh the benefits. The barn is itself insulated by the fact that it contains the cow, who generates body heat at a rate that keeps the interior of a small, well-constructed barn meaningfully above the outdoor temperature. But the barn must be tended. Twice a day, regardless of weather, the cow must be fed and watered. The water in the barn trough freezes overnight in the worst cold and must be broken or replaced. The hay must be forked in sufficient quantity. These are not tasks that can be skipped because the weather is bad, because the outcome of skipping them is a dead cow, and a dead cow is a catastrophe in the specific material sense of the word. So you go out, you put on everything you have, you open the door into whatever the morning has brought. You find the rope, always find the rope first, and you follow it to the barn, hand over hand, through the wind, through the snow, if there is snow, through the particular white blindness of a plains morning that tells you nothing about what the day will be, except that it is cold. In the barn, the smell is warm, hay and animal, and the specific comfort of a living creature, who is, in its own wordless way, glad to see you. The cow turns her head. She knows the routine. You fork the hay. You break the ice in the trough. You check her as you always check her, for the signs that something is wrong, that the cold has gotten to her in some way, that the night has been harder than the barn could manage. She is fine. She is always fine most mornings. Most mornings the winter does not take the cow. You go back to the house, hand over hand on the rope. Captain meets you at the door. The 1888 blizzard, the one they still talk about. On the morning of January 12th, 1888, across the Dakotas, Minnesota, Nebraska, and Kansas, the children went to school. This is worth noting. January 12th was a Thursday, and the morning of that Thursday was, by the standards of a plains winter, almost pleasant. The temperature was above 0. The sky was clear, or nearly clear. The wind was calm. Teachers opened their schoolhouse doors, and children filed in, and the day began. By noon the sky to the northwest had turned a colour that experienced plains settlers recognised and feared, a particular bruised greenish grey, the colour of a sky that is manufacturing something terrible. By early afternoon the temperature had begun to drop. By mid-afternoon the storm hit. The temperature dropped 60 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of hours. 60 degrees. The wind went from calm to 70 miles per hour. The snow, fine, dry, driven horizontally by that wind, reduced visibility to nothing in minutes. The sky and the ground became one white thing, and the horizon disappeared, and the direction of north and south and east and west became equally meaningless. Children were in their schoolhouses when this happened. Schoolhouses that, in many cases, had been built quickly and cheaply, with minimal insulation on the open prairie, away from any shelter. Some teachers kept their students inside. They burned the school's fuel, and when it was gone, they burned the furniture, the desks, the chairs, the floorboards, to keep the room warm until help could come or the storm could pass. Their students survived. Other teachers, assessing the situation incorrectly, decided to walk their students home before the storm got worse. Most of them were within a mile of the nearest farms. Most of them did not make it. 235 people died in the school children's blizzard. The majority were children, walking home from school through conditions in which they could not see their own hands in front of their faces, in which the wind drove snow crystals with enough force to shred exposed skin, in which the temperature was dropping faster than any living person in those places had ever experienced. The survivors told stories later of doing the only thing they could do: stop moving, huddle together, use each other's bodies for warmth, and wait. Some of them were found alive by searchers the next day. Some of them had waited in places where the searching took longer, and they were not found alive. This is the extreme version. This is the worst day. But it illustrates something that was present in every frontier winter, in every family's reckoning with the season. The danger was real. It was not dramatic danger most of the time. Most of the time it was quiet and incremental and patient. But it was always there, and it did not forgive the errors that modern heating systems forgive without notice. The knowledge they borrowed here is a truth that the frontier settlers' letters and diaries often minimized, for reasons of pride and cultural discomfort, but that the historical record makes clear. Much of what kept them alive, they did not figure out themselves. The indigenous peoples of the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains had been living in this landscape for thousands of years. They had accumulated, through generations of direct experience, an extraordinarily sophisticated body of knowledge about how to survive its winters. They knew the specific properties of the materials available. They knew how the wind behaved in different configurations of terrain. They knew which plants prepared which ways, prevented which deficiencies. They knew things about snow, its types, its properties, its uses and dangers, that the European settlers would take years to learn through their own painful experience, if they learned them at all. Some settlers learned, they watched, they asked, They adopted practices that seemed strange to their European-trained sensibilities, but that worked demonstrably in ways their own traditions sometimes did not. They packed snow against their walls, the way they had seen native people pack snow around their lodges. They lined their winter clothing with the same materials, prepared in the same ways. They learned to read the specific quality of the prairie sky that preceded a bad storm, the greenish tinge, the particular behaviour of animals before a blizzard, because people who had been reading that sky for 10 generations had learned to read it correctly. Others did not learn. They maintained their European traditions because those traditions were familiar, because changing them felt like an acknowledgement of inadequacy, because the cultural assumption of their superiority over the people they were displacing made it difficult to accept that those people knew things they did not. The settlers who learned generally had better winters. The ones who did not sometimes had winters from which they did not return. This is not complicated. Knowledge is knowledge regardless of its source, and the cold does not care about cultural pride. One practice adopted quietly by many plain settlers and rarely credited to its actual origin: sleeping platforms elevated from the ground. Rather than laying a mattress on the earthen floor, which conducted cold directly into the bedding from below, they built simple wooden frames that raised the sleeping surface several inches, sometimes a foot. The cold air pooled at floor level. The sleeping surface was above it. The difference in temperature was small but consistent, and small consistent differences matter when you're in a thermal situation as marginal as a soddy in February. Indigenous neighbours had slept elevated from ground level for the same reasons for thousands of years before the first European settler arrived with a mattress and a puzzled expression. The long dark. What February felt like. By February, the family has been indoors for 3 months. Not completely indoors. The barn chores continue. The water must be fetched. Occasionally, the necessity of travel overrides the sensible preference for staying inside. But the operative reality of February on the frontier, for a family in a sod house on the Great Plains, is that you are inside. You have been inside. You will be inside for at least another 6 weeks, probably more. The soddy is 12 by 16 feet. Do the mathematics. The daily routine has not changed since November. The stove is fed. The meals are prepared from the narrowing store. The children complete whatever tasks they have been assigned, and then do what children do when confined to a small space with no alternative entertainment. They argue. They invent games. They tell stories. They make each other laugh, and then make each other furious and then laugh again. The adults do not argue, mostly. Not because they have nothing to argue about. The conditions of a frontier winter provide ample material. But because the energy required for a sustained argument is energy that neither of them has. Instead, there is the specific compressed patience of 2 people who know each other completely and are spending every waking and sleeping hour within arm's reach of each other, and who have decided, consciously or not, that the marriage will survive the winter, and therefore certain conversations can wait for spring. The light is the thing that is hardest to explain to someone who has not experienced it. February on the northern plains gives you perhaps 9 hours of daylight, and of those 9 hours, the light itself has a quality that is different from summer light, thinner, more exhausted, coming in at a low angle through the small window and illuminating the room in a way that emphasizes rather than alleviates the darkness. You are always at some level aware of the light. You plan around it. You do the tasks that require good visibility during the narrow window when good visibility exists. And you do the other tasks, the tasks that can be done by firelight, by touch, by habit in the hours when the light is gone. By February, you are also aware, in a way that feels almost physical, of the contrast between the white world outside and the dark world inside. The snow reflects light in a way that makes the outdoors, on clear days, almost painfully bright. A white that has no depth to it, that erases shadows and distances and makes the horizon seem to advance towards you rather than recede. Inside, by contrast, the room is all shadow and smoke, and the orange glow of the fire. Moving between the two, stepping outside into the blinding white, then back inside into the dim warm dark, is a sensory experience so jarring that some settlers wrote about it in almost physical terms. Their eyes hurt, their heads hurt, their bodies did not know what to do with the transition. The cough. Every frontier family by February has at least one person who coughs. The air inside the soddy, heated by a wood or coal fire and circulated by whatever air exchange the gaps in the structure permit, is dry and smoky and carries whatever respiratory ailments the winter has introduced. The children cough. The adults suppress cough sometimes. The baby, when sick, coughs with the specific hollow sound that makes parents lie awake listening to it through the night, counting the intervals between coughs, calculating. Cough medicine in 1872 is a limited category. Onion syrup, honey, strong tea, the particular comfort of a hot cloth on the chest, which does approximately nothing medically but provides warmth and the psychological benefit of someone doing something. Prayer, the specific prayer of parents for sick children in the dark. Sometimes the prayer works in the sense that the child recovers. Sometimes it works in the sense that it provides comfort while circumstances beyond anyone's control determine the outcome. Outside, the snow continues, or the wind continues, or both. The weather on the Great Plains in February is not consistently severe. There are clear days, calm days, days when the temperature rises toward freezing and the snow softens and the sky shows patches of the blue that will eventually belong to spring. These days are disproportionately treasured. The children burst out of the door like compressed air from a sealed container. They run, they shout, they throw snow, they fall down in it. They are outdoors in winter, and it is not immediately dangerous, and they are celebrating this fact with everything they have. You watch from the doorway. The air is cold but bearable. The sun, low on the southern horizon, has a quality of warmth that it has not had for months. Not enough to actually warm the air, but enough that your face, turned toward it, feels the touch of something it has been missing. Spring, you think. Spring is coming. It is February 14th. Spring is at least 6 weeks away. But the thought is enough. The rituals, what got them through. There is a specific set of rituals that a frontier family develops by their first winter, and refines by their second, and maintains through all the winters that follow. These rituals are not formal, they are not named, they do not appear in any guide. Nobody taught them to you. They emerge from the specific shape of your days and the specific needs of your family and the specific nature of the winter you are in. The evening ritual begins when the light fails. One person banks the stove. One person checks the water bucket. Is it moved inside? Is it full enough for the morning? The children are sent to use the outhouse, which in winter is a task performed with a speed and commitment that rivals any other activity in the family's daily life. The boots are removed. The stockings remain. The caps go on. Someone reads, if there is light enough, and a book or newspaper in the house. The Bible most likely, because the Bible was the book most families had. It was read not only for religious reasons, but for the same reason people have always read aloud to each other in confined spaces in the evening, because the sound of a voice reading carries its own warmth, because a story, any story, is a door out of the room you're sitting in, because the human mind requires more than the walls it is surrounded by. If there is no book, or the light is too low, then there are stories. The father tells the children about the place they came from. The farm back in Ohio, the town in Germany, the village in Norway. He tells them stories that they have heard before, and will ask to hear again, not because they do not know the endings, but because the stories locate them somewhere, give them a context larger than the soddy and the winter and the endless grass. The mother might sing the specific songs of wherever she came from, in whatever language she grew up with. German lullabies sung by a woman who has been on the plains for 3 years, and has almost forgotten the look of the Rhine. Norwegian folk songs that carry, in their melody, the specific quality of cold that is different from plains cold, sharper, saltier, the cold of a different landscape. The children sing along with the parts they know. They fall asleep sometimes before the song is finished, their breath evening out, their small forms going still and heavy under the quilts. The parents keep their voices low and finish the song anyway, for themselves, for the room, for the dark that is pressing in from outside, and that the song in its way holds at bay, the specific ritual of the hot stone or brick. You have been doing this since November, and it has become as automatic as everything else in the evening routine. A flat stone, or a brick if you have a brick, heated in or on the stove through the afternoon until it holds the day's warmth deep in its mass, then wrapped in cloth, a scrap of old blanket, a piece of flannel worn too thin for other use, and placed at the foot of the bed. The stone's warmth is not dramatic. It does not keep the bed warm all night. By 2 a.m. it will be cold, just another dense object under the quilts. But for the first hours of the night, when the body is making its initial adjustment to the cold air above the quilts and the warmer pocket developing below, the stone at the feet makes a difference that is felt rather than measured, a warmth that travels up from the feet, that eases the specific clenched discomfort of toes that have been cold all day. The children have names for the stone, not the same names every winter, new names each year, as the stone becomes a character in the small mythology of the family's winter. This year it is Old Bessie. Next year it'll be something else. The naming matters not at all and matters completely, because the naming is a small act of reclaiming comfort from discomfort, of making something human in a situation that can feel relentlessly inhuman. What the morning meant, when you've gone to sleep in a cold room and managed the fire through the night, and woken at intervals to the sound of wind or the silence of a fire going low, and gotten up in the dark to address it, and gone back to sleep, and woken again, and slept again. The morning has a specific quality. It is not the morning of a person who slept well in a warm room. It is something different. It is the morning of someone who got through the night, who made it to the far side of the dark, who has confirmed once again that the fire can be managed and the coal can be kept at a distance and the family still present and intact. You push the quilts back. The cold hits your face and shoulders. You do not linger. You stand up, cross to the stove, feed it from the fuel you staged near the stove the night before. You adjust the damper. The fire responds, a change in the sound, a brightening in the glow through the vent. You stand there for a moment, hands near the warmth. Light is starting at the window. Not much. The sun rises late in February and comes in low, but enough to see the room by. The children are still asleep. The baby is making the small sounds of waking. The dog gets up from his place at the foot of the bed, stretches with the full body commitment of a large dog who has been motionless for 8 hours, and looks at you. You put the water on for coffee, or for whatever approximates coffee in the current state of the supply. You cut the cornmeal for the morning mush. You check the flour situation, mentally, automatically, the way you always check it. The fire is up. The room is beginning to warm. The children will wake in 20 minutes probably, drawn by the sounds of morning and the smell of food and the specific quality of light that tells them the night is over. Outside, the world is white and cold and silent. It will be white and cold and silent for at least another 6 weeks, possibly more. But this morning, this particular morning, the morning of this particular night, you made it. The fire is going. The family is asleep and whole and warm under the quilts. The baby is waking with the uncomplicated urgency of an infant who has decided that morning is happening now, and that the household should be informed. You pick her up. She is warm from the night, solid and heavy with sleep. She looks at your face with the specific focus of a baby learning the world, cataloguing your features against the template of her only certainty, which is you. The morning light comes in through the window. The stove ticks and hums. The dog sits by the door, ready for whatever the day will bring. The specific experience of 2 in the morning. 2 in the morning is its own country. In the ordinary run of a frontier winter, 2 in the morning is when the fire needs attention. The coal or the wood that was added when you went to bed at 9 or 10 has done its work. The stove has cooled from its operational temperature. The room, which was holding somewhere around 50 degrees when you lay down, has begun its slow drift downward, and the specific quality of the air has changed. Not dramatically, not yet, but perceptibly, if you are paying the kind of attention that a frontier winter teaches you to pay. You wake because something woke you, not a sound, not an alarm, not the cry of a child, something subtler, a change in the quality of the air against your face above the quilts, a shift in the texture of the cold, something that the body registers before the conscious mind catches up. You lie still for a moment, in the specific liminal space between sleep and waking, and you assess the fire, the children, the wind which tells you something about the temperature outside by its own tone. A higher register means colder and faster. A lower register means the temperature has moderated. The baby, whose breathing you track even in sleep, even now, even after months of this. You push the quilts back. The cold hits, not gradually. There is no gradual about it. One moment you're in the warm pocket that your body has maintained under the quilts for the past 4 hours. The next moment you are a person in a cold room at 2 a.m, swinging your legs over the side of the bed, feet finding the floor, which is always colder than the air by several degrees, because the floor is connected to the frozen earth outside through 2 feet of sod. The specific sensation of wool stockings on a cold earthen floor, not quite cold enough to be painful, cold enough to be emphatically present, the body registering it as a priority. You move to the stove. You do not light a lamp. You know where everything is, and the coals give enough glow to work by. Orange light through the vents, just enough. You open the stove door. The coals are there, banked under ash the way you banked them. Still alive, still enough to catch new fuel quickly. You add the fuel, coal from the bucket staged beside the stove, or a piece of wood or whatever you have, and you watch the fire take it, the coals brightening, the fuel beginning to blacken at the edges, the heat beginning to build. You stand there for a moment, hands extended toward the stove. The warmth reaches your palms. It does not yet reach your feet. It does not reach your shoulders, but your palms are warm and the stove is going, and in 15 minutes the room will have recovered enough that the drift toward genuine cold has been reversed. You look at the room in the cold glow, dark, the children visible on the trundle, the specific lump of a sleeping child, complete, still with the absolute stillness that only sleeping children achieve. Your wife beside them turned away, breathing. The baby in the cradle, invisible in the dark but audible. The soft, regular breath of a sleeping infant. That is the most specific and the most irreplaceable sound you know. Everything is where it was. Everyone is all right. The fire ticks. You go back to bed. The quilts receive you. The cold that accumulated on the surface during the few minutes you were up dissipates within seconds under the body heat that the quilts preserved below. The warmth rises. The specific comfort of being warm after being briefly cold, more acute than ordinary warmth, more felt, because the contrast makes it real. You lie still and listen to the fire and the wind and the breathing. You sleep. The morning after bad weather. A blizzard on the Great Plains has a specific aftermath. You wake to quiet. The wind that has been running at 70 miles an hour for the past 16 hours has stopped, or so reduced itself that the difference approaches silence. This quiet wakes you as surely as the wind had kept you company through the night. The absence of the sound that had been constant is itself a kind of sound, a negative note that the body registers as change. You lie still for a moment and listen. The fire is going. You got up twice in the night to feed it, tracking the storm by the sound of the wind, staying up a little longer each time because when the wind was at its worst, the stove consumed fuel faster, and the room cooled from 2 directions simultaneously, from outside through the walls and from the fire's increased draft. But the fire is going now. You banked it carefully the last time you were up, 2 hours ago, and it has held. You get up. The door tells you the first fact, how deep the drift is. If the door opens easily, the storm did not deposit its full attention on your particular threshold. If the door resists, if you have to push against it with your shoulder and feel it give in increments, the night has left you adrift to deal with. This morning the door resists. You push. It gives slowly. cold air comes in around the edges before the door is open enough to step through, and then you're outside, and the world is white. Not the white of a light snowfall that has covered the grass and left the familiar landscape slightly muffled. The white of a blizzard's aftermath, which is the white of having been remade. The drifts are not where the snow fell. The snow on the plains does not fall so much as it travels, driven horizontally by the wind, accumulating wherever something stops it or redirects it. Against the south wall of the soddy, which is the wall that faced away from the storm, there is almost nothing. The wind swept it clean. Against the north wall the drift is up to the eaves. The path to the barn is gone. Of course it is gone. Nothing on the plain stays where it is placed during a blizzard. You find the rope, because you always find the rope first, and you follow it, hand over hand, through drifts that in some places are knee-deep, and in some places are hip-deep, until the barn door appears out of the white. The cow inside is well. She's been cold. The barn was not built for a storm of that intensity, but she has the specific pragmatic resilience of a creature who does not spend energy on complaint, and who has been through this before. You fork her hay. You break the ice in the water trough. You stand in the barn for a moment, in the specific warmth that a cow generates by being a large warm animal in an enclosed space. Then you go back along the rope. Inside the soddy, the children are awake. They are excited by the snow, which children always are, and which parents always are not, because the snow means 2 weeks of a path to re-establish, and a wood pile to dig out, and a morning of delayed chores that put everything else behind. But the children are excited, and their excitement is not wrong, because the snow is extraordinary, and the world outside is a different world from the one that went to bed last night, and the specific capacity of children to find wonder in this without being burdened by its implications is one of the things that makes the winter bearable for the adults who are burdened by those implications. You start the breakfast, you make your calculation about the day's tasks. You do not make the calculation out loud because the children do not need to hear it, and your wife already knows it. The cornmeal goes on. The stove ticks. Outside, the changed white world holds its silence. You are still here. The family is still here. The cow is still here. The fire is going. This is a good morning. This morning qualifies as a good morning. The community, you were not alone. The popular image of the frontier settler is of isolation, the lone family on the wide plains, surrounded by grass and sky, cut off from everything and everyone they had known before. This was sometimes true. It was not always true, and it was not usually the complete truth. Settlers clustered when they could. A claim was 160 acres, which is 1/4 of a square mile, which sounds like a great deal of space, but which placed neighbours, potentially, within sight of each other's chimney smoke. On the flatter sections of the plains, where the land was settled densely, you could see 3 or 4 other soddies from the rise behind your house. You knew those families. You had helped them bank their snow in November, and they had helped you. You had borrowed a tool and returned it. You had eaten at their table when the weather made travel unwise, and they had eaten at yours. The community of the frontier in winter operated on the specific mathematics of mutual dependence. Nobody had enough of everything. Everybody had some of something. The family 3 miles east had a surplus of dried corn. The family a mile north had a cow that was producing more milk than they needed. You had skill, a knowledge of machinery repair, or of medicine, or of construction, that the family 2 miles south had a current and pressing need for. These exchanges did not always happen through formal arrangements. Sometimes they happened through the specific awareness of a community that paid attention to each other across the distances of the plains, that noticed when a chimney was not smoking at the time it should be, that sent someone to check when the silence of a neighbouring soddy extended past what was ordinary. People died alone on the frontier. It happened. It was one of the genuine risks of the isolated claim, the single family too far from neighbours, the storm that prevented travel for too long, the illness that escalated before anyone knew it had started. But most people did not die alone. Most people had someone within a half-day's travel who knew them, who would come if they sent word, who would send word if they did not appear when they were expected. The community carried the burden of the winter jointly. The wood-cutting party, a gathering of several families with oxen and axes, spending a day cutting and hauling timber from wherever timber could be found, dividing the result among the households that participated, was both economic necessity and social event. The women talked, the men worked, the children ran in the snow until they were called in. The specific warmth of people working together at something that mattered in cold air and physical effort produced a heat that the stove in the soddy could not quite replicate. The letters that settlers wrote to each other when distance prevented the visit have a specific quality that distinguishes them from the letters written back east. They assume a shared understanding. They do not explain the cold or the wind or the state of the fuel supply. They reference these things as givens, as the shared background of their world, and they write about what is interesting, what is different this week from last week, what the children said, what the weather did that was unexpected, what the spring is looking like from here. They wrote to each other because the community was real, because it extended across the distances of the plains, because the shared experience of the winter created a bond that the shared experience of a different season would not have made in the same way. They had been cold together. They had made it through together. That meant something. It still does. The first day of spring on the Great Plains, does not arrive. It proposes itself. It offers hints. It suggests the possibility of a different season, and then withdraws and suggests again, and then withdraws again, testing the willingness of the world to accept the change before committing to it. The first day that actually feels like something other than winter might be in March or in early April, depending on the year. It is not necessarily warm. 50 degrees is warm in the context of 6 months of temperatures well below freezing, and 50 degrees in a wind is still cold, still the kind of day where a coat is required. But there is a quality to the light that has changed, and a quality to the smell of the air that has changed, and something in the specific texture of the silence, which is now occasionally interrupted by bird song in a way that it was not interrupted for months. The grass under the snow is green. You know this because you have watched it disappear in November, and you know it will be green again because it was green before. And the specific science of prairie grass is that it never entirely dies. It retreats below the frost line and waits, patient as anything that has been doing this for 10,000 years. And when the temperature rises, it comes back with a speed that is startling every time, even when you're expecting it. You open the door on this first day that feels like something different. The cold air comes in, but it is different cold air. Not the mineral emptiness of February cold, but something that carries at its edge the faint biological note of frozen ground beginning to move. The children burst outside. The dog bursts outside. You follow more slowly because you're an adult and you have been wrong before about spring, and you're not going to be extravagant in your hope until the hope is confirmed. You stand outside the soddy and you look at the sky, which is a different blue than the winter sky, higher somehow, more confident in its blueness. And you look at the horizon, which still shows the winter's flatness, but which has, somewhere out at the edge, the first faint suggestion of a different colour in the grass. The stove inside is still going. You have not stopped needing the stove. You will not stop needing it for another several weeks. But the worst is over. You know it is over, not because of any single sign, but because of the accumulation of signs. The light, the smell, the quality of the birdsong that arrived this morning from somewhere south of where the birds had been all winter. The winter did what it always does. It tried to keep you. It tested everything, the fuel and the food and the structure of the soddy and the structure of the family and the structure of the individual human will to continue getting up at 2 a.m. and feeding the fire and going back to bed and doing it again the next night and the night after that. And you are still here. The stove ticks inside. The dog is running in a large happy circle in the flattened winter grass. The children are shouting at each other about something that does not matter and is wonderful. Your wife comes to stand beside you in the doorway. You do not say anything. There is nothing to say that would add to this moment, or that the moment needs. You stand together and look at the sky. Spring is coming. It was always coming. You simply had to get through the winter first, and you did. What it actually meant to survive. These family, the settlers on the Great Plains, the homesteaders in the mountain territories, the men and women and children who built their houses out of dirt and managed their fires with the precision of people for whom miscalculation had real consequences. They were not exceptional people. They were ordinary people in exceptional circumstances. They were farmers and teachers and tradespeople and their children. They were people who had left familiar places because the land here was cheap or free, and the land back there was expensive or scarce. They were people who had stood at the edge of a claim in September and looked at the enormous sky and believed, with the specific conviction of people who had not yet experienced the thing they were about to experience, that they could do this. And then they did it. Not easily, not comfortably, not without cost. The winters took children and took elderly parents and took the animals that a family's livelihood depended on, and occasionally took the adults themselves, when the combination of circumstances and misfortune conspired to produce outcomes that all the preparation and all the resilience in the world could not prevent. But most of them survived most winters, because the quilts held the heat, and the fire was managed, and the snow was banked against the walls, and the rope was tied to the barn, and the children knew where the rope was, and the dog slept at the foot of the bed, and the stone stayed warm until 2 a.m, and the songs carried through the dark until the children slept, and parents lay awake for a little while longer, listening to the wind and listening to the breathing and concluding for this night that everything was all right. The morning came, the fire was going, the cornmeal was in the pot. They were still here. That was the victory. Not a dramatic victory, not a victory that would be remembered or celebrated or written down in any history that paid attention to famous events and famous people. Just the quiet, daily, stubborn victory of ordinary people in a difficult place doing what was necessary and doing it again the next day and the day after that. Spring would come. They knew it would come because it always had. And when it came, the snow would recede and the grass would green up with a speed that still surprised even people who'd seen it before. And the sky would open and the lights would change and the first warm day would hit the skin like something remembered from a previous life. But that was spring. That was later. Tonight it is winter. The wind is outside. The fire is inside. The quilts are heavy and warm and smell like home. The specific sensory experience of cold. Let us be very precise about cold. Not cold as a concept. Not cold as a temperature number. The actual physical experience of the specific cold that a frontier family in Nebraska in January of 1874 would have experienced in their bodies, in their hands and feet and faces, hour by hour through the night. Cold begins at the extremities. This is not a poetic observation. It is the biology of a body managing its temperature resources. When the ambient temperature drops below what the body can comfortably maintain through normal metabolism, the body begins to prioritize. The core stays warm, the trunk stays warm, the brain and the vital organs maintain their operating temperature. The hands and the feet and the ears and the nose, these are negotiable. The blood flow to these areas reduces and they become by degrees less warm. The first sign is the specific sensation in the fingertips. Not pain yet, a heaviness, a slightly delayed response when you try to flex your fingers, as though the connection between the intention and the movement has developed a small lag. Then if the cold continues, the fingers begin to ache. This ache is different from the ache of exertion. It is deeper, more insistent, located in the bone rather than the muscle. The toes follow a similar progression. Feet on a cold floor, the specific earthen floor of a soddy in January, lose their warmth more quickly than feet in bed, because the floor conducts the cold upward into the foot with an efficiency that even thick wool stockings slow but cannot entirely stop. By the time you've been standing on the floor for 3 minutes, feeding the stove at 2 a.m, your feet are significantly colder than they were when you were lying in bed. Your face when you go outside meets the cold differently. The wind, and there is always wind, strips the warmth from exposed skin in a way that has its own vocabulary. The specific burning sensation of skin cooling fast. The way the eyes water in a cold wind, involuntary. The body's response to an ambient temperature below the threshold that the eye's surface expects. The nose running, also involuntary. Also, the body responding to cold air. What you do not feel in any of this is dramatic. The cold does not announce itself. It arrives incrementally, by degrees, each degree building on the previous one. The total impact of an hour in cold air accumulating so gradually that it is easy to underestimate it. The settlers who got into trouble in bad weather were frequently people who had not been paying attention to how cold they had become, who had been focused on the task, getting to the barn, following the rope, completing the chore, and who looked up from the task to discover that they could no longer feel their fingers. Inside the soddy, the cold was different, managed cold, controlled cold, insofar as it could be controlled. The fire held it at bay in the centre of the room, and it retreated toward the walls and the floor and the gaps around the door, and you moved through it the way you moved through any environmental condition that required awareness, noting it, adjusting to it, working around it. The cold in the bed under the quilts was the most specific and the most remembered. The initial temperature of the bed, when you got in, the cold of sheets and quilts that have been in a cold room and have acquired the room's temperature rather than generating their own. The way you moved into the bed carefully, not disrupting the faint warmth that your own previous presence in it may have left, pulling the quilts over you quickly so that the cold air above them did not have time to follow you under. And then the waiting, the specific 5 or 10 minutes of being in a cold bed and generating heat and waiting for the heat to accumulate in the space the quilts enclosed. Your feet, cold in their wool stockings, meeting the cold fabric of the lowest quilt. Your hands, tucked under your chin or pressed between your knees for warmth. Your face above the quilts in the cold air of the room, the only exposed part of you, and then gradually the warmth coming. Building in the pocket of the quilts, your feet beginning to feel less cold. The specific relief of warmth returning to a foot that was cold, a tingling, a thawing, a returning of sensation. The bed, which was cold, becoming a warm thing. Your own warmth, trapped by 3 layers of carefully made fabric, turning the bed into the warmest place in the room. This was the specific pleasure of the frontier winter night. Not comfort, not the ordinary unremarkable comfort of a person who is warm in a warm house, and has always been warm in a warm house, and has no particular awareness of warmth, because warmth is simply the default condition of their existence. Something sharper than that, more specific. The warmth that is felt because its opposite has been experienced. The specific, acute, particular pleasure of being warm inside quilts in a cold room, the contrast between the 2 states making each more vivid. This is what they felt, this specific thing, every night of every winter for the years they were out there. And they remembered it, the ones who wrote it down. The warmth of the quilts in the cold room, the specific comfort of that particular thing. You feel it now in your own warm bed with your own warm blanket. You have always felt it. You simply have not always known to notice it. Notice it tonight. The rope, the thing that saved lives. The rope between the house and the barn was not always there. In the early years of a claim, before the first bad blizzard had arrived and been survived and been understood, the rope was not always considered necessary. Then the first blizzard came. A man named Olaf Halverson, this is a composite name but the experience is real, repeated across hundreds of claims, across the Dakota territories, walked out his door on a January morning to tend his cattle. He had been doing this every morning for 3 months. The barn was 30 feet away. He had walked those 30 feet 10,000 times. The blizzard came in while he was in the barn. Not slowly, there was no slow about it. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in 20 minutes. The wind went from a calm to howling in the time it took him to fork hay to the cattle. The snow, dry and fine, driven horizontally, erased the world outside the barn door as completely as if someone had hung a white sheet across the opening. He could not see the house. The house was 30 feet away. He could not see it. He called out. The wind took his voice and destroyed it. He put his hand out of the barn door into the storm. The wind hit him with a physical force, and the cold, the sudden, violent cold of a plains blizzard at its worst, hit him in a way that no number of cold mornings had prepared him for. This was a different category. He went back into the barn. He closed the door. He stayed with the cattle, which were warm and present, and not 30 feet away through white blindness. He stayed there for 18 hours until the storm broke and the white blindness cleared, and he could see the house 30 feet away, exactly where it had always been, and walk to it. His wife had not known if he was alive for 18 hours. After that, there was a rope. Every family that heard this story, and the story moved fast across the plains, because it was the kind of story that people told each other urgently, because it was the kind of story that contained information that could save a life. Every family that heard it tied a rope from their house to their barn before the next winter. The rope was thick, not a piece of string, not a clothesline, a proper rope, capable of being gripped by a hand that was losing its sensation, capable of being felt through mittens, capable of being followed hand over hand through conditions where your eyes were useless and your sense of direction was actively misleading you. The rope was checked every day, not dramatically, not formally, just checked in the way that you check anything that you depend on. The habitual confirmation that the thing is still there and still attached and still capable of doing its job. In a blizzard, you went outside with the rope in your hand before you let go of the door frame. You found the rope first, then you let go of the door, and you followed it, hand over hand, to the barn and back, 30 feet each way, 60 feet that in an ordinary morning took 20 seconds, and in a blizzard took 10 minutes. Every hand on the rope was a choice to continue, to keep moving forward rather than stopping, which in a bad enough storm was not a metaphorical risk but a literal one. Stopping moving in extreme cold is a step toward not starting again. Hand over hand, the specific sensation of cold rope through cold mittens, the barn door appearing out of the white when you were 3 feet from it, materializing from nothing as though created by the act of reaching for it. Every day it was there. Every day, in the worst of the weather, the rope was the reason. Everyone came back. The specific thing you held on to, the thing that led you home. What they left behind, the legacy. These families, the ones who built soddies from the ground up and managed their fires through the winter nights and followed their ropes through the blizzards and sang to their children in the dark and wrote letters home that described things that were hard to describe. They are almost entirely unnamed in any history that most people know. Not because they were not important, because the history that gets remembered tends to be the history of the dramatic event, the famous name, the single extraordinary moment. The frontier winter was not any of these things. It was the accumulation of 10,000 ordinary decisions made well enough under difficult circumstances by ordinary people who had no particular reason to think of themselves as extraordinary. They were not extraordinary, they were people who needed to live through a winter and found the ways to do it. They were people who understood in the practical way that people understand things when their lives depend on it, that surviving is not a feeling or an intention. It is a set of actions performed consistently, night after night, in the right order, with the specific care of someone who knows that getting it wrong has consequences. They built a culture around the winter because the winter was where they lived for half of every year. The quilts were more than bedding. The fire was more than heat. The rope was more than hemp. The song in the dark was more than comfort. Each of these things carried the weight of all the other things. The whole enterprise of being alive in a difficult place, compressed into the specific object or action, given meaning by the circumstances that made it necessary. The quilts are in museums now. The soddies have returned to earth, most of them, worn down by the decades, absorbed back into the landscapes they were made from, leaving only a slight irregularity in the terrain where a family spent their winters and which is now indistinguishable from the rest of the plains, except that someone, knowing what to look for, can still see the outline. But the ropes are gone. The ropes were used until they wore out and then replaced, or simply not replaced when the need was less urgent. They were never important enough to save. They were too important to think of as artifacts. Somewhere on the Great Plains, in the ground, is the iron staple that one of those ropes was fastened to, driven into the door frame of a soddy that no longer stands by hands that are long gone, before a winter that most people have never heard of. It held. For the years it needed to hold, it held. That is the legacy. Not the famous name or the dramatic event. The rope that held, the fire that was fed, the children who were tucked in, the quilts that were heavy enough, the song that was sung in the dark until the children slept, the morning that came, the family that was still there. That is the legacy of the frontier winter. It does not have a monument. It does not need one. It lives in you tonight, in the warmth of your bed and the weight of your blanket, in the specific, unremarkable comfort of a night that does not require a rope or a fire or a careful calculation of the fuel supply to get through safely. You are the morning they were trying to reach. You are the spring they were enduring the winter for. You simply exist in it, where they were trying to get to. That is enough. That is everything. The women who held it together. History has a habit of remembering the dramatic gesture and forgetting the sustained effort. On the frontier, the dramatic gesture belonged to the blizzard and the fire and the journey west. The sustained effort, the daily, hourly, relentless work of keeping a family alive through a winter belonged largely to the women. This is not a romantic claim. It is an economic and practical observation that the historical record, including the letters and diaries and household inventories of the frontier period, makes with considerable clarity. The woman in a frontier soddy in January managed the fuel with the same careful calculation that a modern financial manager applies to a budget. How much is left? How much is needed? How long until the supply can be replenished? What can be reduced without crossing the line from discomfort into danger? She made this calculation every morning without writing it down, without a spreadsheet, without anyone acknowledging that it was being made, because it was simply what needed to be done, and she was the one who knew how to do it. She managed the food with the same precision. The bean barrel, the cornmeal tin, the salt pork, the dried apples that had been gone since January, and the flour that was almost gone now. She knew the state of every container in the soddy, tracked it the way you track something that your family survival depends on, which is to say, constantly, automatically, with the background vigilance of someone who cannot afford to be surprised by what she finds when she opens a container. She managed the children's health through the winter illnesses, the confined space and the cold and the dry smoky air reliably produced. Not with modern medicine, with hot cloths and onion syrup and the specific warmth of being held by someone who is not going to let go of you, which is its own kind of medicine and has always been its own kind of medicine. She managed the social fabric of the family through the months when the social fabric was under stress, when the children were restless, and her husband was silent with the specific worry of a man who can see the fuel pile getting lower and does not know how to fix it, and the wind was doing what the wind did, and February was doing what February did. She managed this. With a story told in the evening when the fire was low and the mood needed lifting, with a song that the children knew and asked for, and that she sang because it was the right thing to do at this particular moment, even though she was tired, with the specific practical optimism of someone who had no alternative to optimism and had decided that this meant optimism was the right choice. She managed, and she managed, and she managed. And in the spring, when the family emerged from the winter intact and the grass came up green and the sky opened and the world was again what the world was before the winter, she did not receive a particular acknowledgement of what she had done. She went into the spring preparing to do the work of the spring, which was considerable and immediate and pressing. She had kept them alive. The evidence of this was simply that they were alive. The keeping had been so thorough and so consistent that it was invisible, the way the essential things are always invisible until they stop. The letters she wrote home to her mother or her sister in the spring said things like, "The children are well and the winter was hard, but we managed. We are all here. The spring is beautiful." She did not say more than this. There was not more that needed saying. The spring was beautiful. They were all here. This was the achievement, entirely invisible, entirely sufficient, entirely everything. The wind down. Let the story soften now. Let the fire in the stove settle into its low, steady pulse. Let the sound of the wind outside become, gradually, just a sound, not a threat, not a warning, just the voice of the plains doing what the plains always do, indifferent and enormous, and in its own way magnificent. You are in the soddy. You are under the quilts. The dog is warm at your feet. The children are sleeping with the absolute conviction of people who have done everything that was required of them today and are owed these hours of oblivion. The baby is still, her breathing the slow, perfect breathing of deep infant sleep. The stove ticks. The stone at your feet is still warm for now. The gap at the top of the door finds a thread of wind and sings it, very quietly, in a register, just below the edge of annoyance, just at the edge of something like a lullaby, if you are willing to hear it that way. And you are willing tonight, because you're tired and the quilts are heavy and the room is warm enough, and the fire is going to last until 2, and then you will get up and feed it and come back, and the quilts will receive you, and you will sleep again. Think for a moment of the woman who sewed these quilts. She cut the squares from things that had been other things. She sat in the evening in a room like this one, with light that was never quite adequate, and she stitched together the history of her family into something that would keep her children warm. She did not know that she was making something remarkable. She thought she was making a quilt. Think of the man who cut the sod and stacked it into walls. He did not think he was making architecture. He thought he was making a place to sleep. He thought he was doing what had to be done. And then the next thing, and then the next thing after that, because that was what the winter required. Think of the child who slept in this bed, and name the warming stone, old Bessie, and grew up and left and carried with her, somewhere in the particular warmth that you feel toward the past when you're old enough to miss it, the specific smell of this room, the specific weight of these quilts, the specific sound of the stove at 2 a.m. when someone got up to feed it. She never forgot the sound. Think of the rope tied to the door frame before the first blizzard, tested by hands that needed it to hold, followed hand over hand through white blindness, and coal that had no bottom to it, leading back to the house that was always where it had been, always 30 feet away, always there, the rope held because someone tied it properly, because someone understood what it was for and did the work of tying it before it was needed, because the time to tie a rope is not in the middle of a blizzard, but on a calm autumn afternoon, when tying a rope seems almost unnecessary. That is what they understood. That is the specific knowledge of people who live in a difficult place long enough to learn its rhythms, that the preparation happens before the emergency, that the rope is tied before the storm, that the fuel is stacked before the cold, that the quilts are made before November. They prepared, and then they survived, and then they prepared again. Every autumn, every winter, every spring that rewarded them by arriving. You are warm now. You have always been warm. The wind is outside, the fire is inside. The quilts are exactly heavy enough, and they smell like home, and they were made by hands that understood what they were making and why it mattered and who would sleep under them. Let your breath slow. Let your body go heavy. The stove will hold until 2. You do not need to worry about the stove. The rope is tied. The snow is banked. The dog is at your feet. The children are still. Everything that can be done has been done. And it was enough. It is always enough when it is done with the specific care of people who understand what the winter requires. Sleep now. Sleep well. You would not have survived a frontier winter. But tonight, warm and still, and carried gently by the story of the people who did, you have come close enough to understand what it cost them and what they made of it. They made it through. All those winters, all those 2 a.m. stove feedings and rope followings, and bean barrel calculations, and quilts over the children tuckings, and songs in the dark singings. All of it sustained, night after night, winter after winter, until the winters ended and the springs came, and the grass was green again. They made it through, so will you. Rest now. The morning is coming. It always does. The fire is going. The family is still here. The spring will come. It always does.